All right, hey y'all, I am Jared DeMott, and I'm going to be talking about war stories on embedded security, pen testing, IoT, building managers, and how we can do better. So I'll just jump right in that. First of all, I always like to express my thankfulness. I don't think we all do that enough, but past coworkers, the present people that I work with, some of which are in here, brilliant people in the field that I respect and admire and just love and have a good time working with. So thank the conference organizers. Appreciate them having us back to teach two of our EDA Labs classes we had here this year, just like last year. If you've never taken one, you should. Also, speaking again for many times. I've been in the field for a long time, but third year Derbycon, so a lot of good stuff. I also want to thank the keynotes. I really thought that, I don't know how many of you guys watched the keynotes this morning. Did you guys watch? Matt and John was really good. They kind of reminded us to, have some humility and some integrity in what we do, particularly as it relates to hacking. John told that story, which really creeped me out, about a guy that was just like going through all the webcams and stuff. I don't know if you watched this talk, but it's just, there's a lot of stuff out there that you can get into that's a lot of gray areas. So we'll talk about actually some of that in the talk. So security community in general, love y'all, thankful to be here as always. So good stuff. This talk's a little bit different than prior years. So like a year ago, for example, Josh, who's up front here, him and I talked on binary ninja versus IDA. So if you've watched my talks or followed any of the research I've done throughout the 17 years I've been in the field, a lot of it's been kind of low level. A lot of it's been sort of security research, kind of down in the bits and the bytes. 2 years ago, I gave a talk on Windows 10 CFG bypass. So this year it's a little bit less in the weeds and kind of a little more fun talk. Just kind of came up for air a little bit, and it's not quite as, still has vulnerabilities, hacking techniques, and it's very, it's still technical in nature, but it's not quite as down in the weeds, which if you were here for the last talk is probably a good thing, because the last talk was going through like methodical structures and security descriptors and stuff, and it was like good stuff, but sometimes, an hour of that is like, whew, it's a lot to get through, right? So, interesting, one of the things when you come up for air, you get to kind of consider some of the things you've seen in the field for 17 years. One thing that I notice is that even though a lot's changed, when you think about all the like mitigations that we have, for example, in Windows 10, there's CFG and Emmet and isolated heap and deferred free, and I don't know if you follow exploit mitigations and stuff, but there's like, it's crazy hard to land certain types of exploits now compared to what it used to be, and yet we're as vulnerable as we ever were, right, as a people in a society, and because, there's a lot of reasons why that is, but because technology is growing at a pace faster than those things can be secured. So even though it is possible to secure things, and we do it in certain niche areas, it's not being done broadly. And that's kind of what this talk is really about. It's kind of a broader look at, oh my, there's still a lot of stuff out there. So I'm the founder of EDA Labs. You should check out our website and check out some of the stuff that we do. I've got some classes on Pluralsight, which you should also check out. A lot of good stuff there. I teach also part-time at DSU, which is really cool. Former NSA, former CTO. I got some pictures of random stuff on the screen. It's kind of cool, right? Nice icons. So, woo! All right, so with the background stuff out of the way, what's today's talk about? Well, first, just briefly, this is like a pen tester's con, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of unique, right? Years ago, there really wasn't such a thing, right? If you're an old fart like me and you started going to DEF CON and Black Hat back in 2001, all the cons were really more security research oriented. It's not until just the last probably 6 years that there was a con that's really, kind of focused on pen testing. So all that to say, that's cool. And I probably don't need to go into the detail of what a typical pen test looks like. A lot of you probably already know. So I'll just mention it very briefly. And then what some of the differences of what, if you see an embedded system and how that would fit into, say, a typical corporate pen test. And give some examples and, of course, recommendations at the end on how we can all do better. So a typical pen test, if you haven't done it and you haven't been coming to this conference for a long time, would include things like an external audit, where you kind of try to hack into the company from the outside in through, servers with vulnerabilities and whatever else, or apps. An internal pen test, so once you're in, what do? You find all the stuff, hack all the things. There's probably a song about that, I think. Wireless audits, social engineering, all really cool stuff. Physical pen testing, social engineering, all that good stuff. It's really, really fun stuff. That's kind of the typical stuff that a pen test includes. And what's interesting about that is that it probably doesn't include the building controller, the HVAC system, and maybe the camera system, and some of the other stuff that, well, because that's not owned by the IT director, right? They don't, like, he didn't have that stuff installed. Maybe doesn't even know about that stuff. That was put in by the facilities people. And the facilities people aren't technologists, but they hired it out to a third-party company who put in the camera systems and the building controller and, you know, all that stuff. So it's really cool. Nothing wrong with that, right? Well, the problem is a lot of that stuff's not very secure, and so that's you know, kind of what we'll talk about in the talk. Is just some funny things that we've noticed while we do pen test are some of those systems and some of the vulnerabilities in them. They're kind of interesting and humorous, but what's not so funny is that a lot of times you have kind of that, well, that's not my problem, you know, sort of mindset, right? Where the person who's in charge of IT or security is like, well, you know, I'm not going to pay to get a pen test done on the building controller because that's not, like, in my budget. That's not my problem. Like, well, whose problem is it then, right? So that in and itself is a problem. So the takeaway there is really all technology and the security of all technology does need to flow through the CISO, right? Somebody needs to be kind of, the buck has to stop somewhere for all that stuff. Otherwise, you know, when it hits the news and the media and there's a major breach, whether you thought it was your problem or not, if you're the CISO, you're still going to get fired probably, right? Or you're going to have to retire, whichever comes first. So it is your problem, whether you know it or not. And so that's kind of, you know, one of the obvious takeaways there. So, I mean, in terms of who should test that then, when it comes to those embedded systems, IoT, all that stuff, you know, one of the obvious things is the manufacturer should pen test that, right? They should write it securely and it should be safe, and so it's their problem. That's the idea. Well, true, and they need to do more, right? But it's still not strictly their problem. It still has to be installed right. It still needs to be monitored and managed by IT. So there's a lot that needs to get done on all sides of that, right? So there's a real cooperative effect that needs to take place for this to be done well. So as a buyer, you could ask your sales rep, hey, that building controller you're trying to sell me, like, tell me about the SDLC. What do you know about secure development lifecycle? Do your developers follow that? And they'll look at you like, huh? And you won't get any, like, it'll be a completely unfruitful, unproductive conversation because they won't know what you're talking about. And so that's part of the problem too. Not enough people know about this stuff, right? And so that's kind of bad. I mean, unless you're a hacker, then it's kind of good. But we're taking this talk from sort of the good guys approach, from trying to be safe. So what are some of the differences then in IoT, embedded systems, SCADA, building controllers compared to typical IT? Some of them are good. And so I'm not down on IoT, by the way, at all. Like, some people are like, oh, IoT is going to ruin the world because it's, you know, it's really insecure and we're all going to die and stuff like that. Hey, I don't really have that approach. I'm kind of optimistic just in general. I think one of the things that's sweet about IoT is it's really one of the most disruptive technologies since the internet, right? The internet was very disruptive. It changed the way the world works. IoT will do that same thing. Give me an example. Okay. An example of that might be, suppose that there's a snowstorm on its way and you live in the north and you have a snowblower and the spark plug in your snowblower is about to go bad, and Lowe's calls you up and says, hey, we noticed that your snowblower is telling us that your spark plug's about to go bad. You should come in and buy a new one. They're only $2 and you'll be safe during the snowstorm that way. Like, that technology doesn't really exist yet. I don't think there's IoT in snowblowers, but like, that's the kind of thing that's coming, right? With smart fridges and smart snow throwers and like all that stuff is really cool. Like, that has the ability to transform our life in a whole new way. When your vendor can tell you that you're about to burn your cake or you're about to not have a good day with your snow thrower or whatever, that's pretty cool. So the positive potential for any tool, right, is always there, whether it's a hammer or whatever else. You can use that for good, or you could kill somebody with a hammer, right? And so we see that with IoT, that it has huge positive implications. Then again, on the flip side, if you're sort of pessimistic and, you know, kind of like many of us in the room tend to be a little bit at times because we've been in security a long time, you sort of see things from the other side and you're like, well, but that's a huge privacy concern. Do I really want Lowe's to know about my snow thrower? And like, you know, oh, by the way, do they audit that code? And oh, by the way, somebody can hack my snow thrower and like, you know, make it run and cut my leg off or something. Or like, that's one of the crazy things about IoT is that hacking used to be about taking, right? It's like, I'll hack you and I will take your stuff, your credit cards and your social security number and all that stuff. And that's really bad. But with IoT came the possibility of like, I'll reach through the internet and I will kill you. I'll touch you. I'll burn your house down. I'll do whatever, right? Like, that's new. IoT brings that. That's a new thing that didn't really exist before. And that's really scary, right? That's, oh no. And it's particularly bad when a lot of these systems aren't nearly as secure as they could be, because the camera, your IoT-enabled camera has to sell for like $50, and it comes, from the cheapest vendor possible overseas or whatever. So what we see a lot of default creds in these kind of things. It's probably one of the single biggest vulnerabilities in the internet right now, believe it or not, after 20 years of talking about this, is default creds, especially right now, right? Mariah botnet and a lot of other things we saw came from that idea that there's just these credentials we know about for this server, for this system, for this camera, for this building controller, for this thing. We can just log in and do crazy stuff. And you're like, yeah, it's boring, default creds. Maybe. But what's new about the whole thing is that now you can do weird things at scale that you never used to be able to do, right? And we'll see some of that. The Mariah botnet was probably one of the biggest examples of that. You can create a whole army of computers by sort of automating this logging in with default creds and doing something with an army of stuff. So you can do stuff at scale. It's not just you can peekaboo on one person, right? So it's a backdoor. And it was there for a reason traditionally in many of these systems, right? When you think about like a building controller or something like that, something for your heating and cooling or something, because they didn't used to be on the internet. So when the guy with the tool belt showed up and he was going to plug into this thing with his laptop, like he needed to know the user and pass to, fix your air conditioning. And it was good that he knew that so that he could do his job, right? So there was a kind of legitimate reason for that. The problem is, like, I'm not a repairman, right? Or whatever. And yet we know the default credentials too. So that's not a good thing. Okay, so one of the things that makes any embedded system a little scary in some sense too is that sometimes those vulnerabilities will hide for a while too, right? When you think about your automobile or that SCADA system or whatever, because sometimes a lot of people are like, well, I could hack on my car, but like, I take my wife and kids to school in that too. Like if I screw up the brakes, we might die. Like, so maybe I won't hack on my car. I'll reverse yet another Windows binary or something like that, right? Because it's easier, it's safer, I know how to do it. It's in a workflow I understand. I'm gonna leave my car alone, right? And I think that happens a lot, and that's fine. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, except for the security community is, in some cases, a little more reluctant. That's changing. We see a lot more auto work. We see a lot more embedded systems work, but traditionally, it's a little harder to get your hands on some of that stuff. The other thing that's kind of just terrifying is this idea that, this realization that, man, all this code is just, we can't seem to secure it, right? We can't seem to get our arms around it. And no matter what they do, just take Windows, for example. Windows 10 is so secure in some ways, right? It has all these crazy mitigations to stop memory corruption vulnerabilities, and it does a pretty good job at that. And yet people are still hacking it because all you have to do is phish a user and ask them for their user pass, and they'll give it to you, and you can get onto their system, right? So it's like you can't stop all the different types of vulnerabilities there are. And so there's always this need for detection, which is cool. I mean, like, so all of you in the room, you all have job security. Like, there'll always be a job there for you. That's cool. Like, in a way, that's neat. But like, I don't want to put like McAfee on my car, you know what I mean? Like, who wants to, like, you're going to have to put AV on everything? Like, that's really, the idea that, you might buy a brand new Ford and then the Ford dealer says, oh, and by the way, if you want your Ford secure, you have to pay an extra $200 to get like security software put on. It's like, oh, really? Man, try to explain that to my grandparents, they're dead, but it'd be harder. But anyway, it's going to be a tough sell, right? So, all right. One of the other things that's interesting is that, like I said, there's a chance for physical effects. There's also a chance that your hacking will be lesser noticed too, right? Because your IT people don't necessarily own that embedded system or that camera system or whatever, so they're probably not monitoring either. It probably doesn't report its log to the SIM. It probably, you know what I mean? It's probably not getting updated. There's a lot of problems around the monitoring and the management and the security of that whole device. So cyber war just got real, right? It was already real, now it's realer. Okay, so sometimes when we do these pen tests and stuff, we see some really interesting things, and we want to have a deeper look. And sometimes we have time, sometimes we don't. But either way, some of the things we run into a lot are like cameras, like I said, the building management controllers, and so many other systems. You could, find these kind of things all day long, IoT type things, embedded, home routers, and whatever else you want. All these things. One particular system that we see quite often, at least around us, is this exact vision camera system. And it's a system we've seen before, and when you find it, and it's not that hard to find on the internet, all you have to do is basically click on that left box there, and you get a view like this, as long as you know the default credentials, which we know. They're easy to find out. If you don't know, you can do some Googling and find them out. Now, the vendor will tell you, like, okay, that's been fixed in the very most recent version of the system. Like, we now enforce password changes and stuff like that. Most of these type of systems, they'll tell you that. The problem is a lot of these, like, building controllers and expensive camera systems and stuff, they were sold as an expensive item that was meant to last a long time. So you're going to find very few customers using the latest and greatest, and a lot of customers using old stuff, right? So there's a lot of very vulnerable systems out there. And so, oh man, you got to kind of look into it and try to figure out who the actual vendor is and figure out how to report it. It's a big pain. That's actually a system that manages other cameras. So all these other cameras fit into this camera system. And it's pretty easy to find these things on the internet. You can go to a little thing called Shodan. If you haven't heard of what Shodan is, it does things that are not really revelational in our field, right? It basically, like, port scans or Nmaps systems, and then you can figure out that, oh, there's this IP address with, you know, this, like, string, and it's whatever web server, and it has these ports open. Okay, boring. We did that 20 years ago, right? Wrong. What's really interesting about Shodan is basically what's really cool about it is they've done that for you, so you don't have to do that. Yes, we could have done that 10 or 20 years ago, but now you don't have to. You can just go to this portal, put in what you're looking for, and it's like, here's the list of things that meet that criteria. So it's like pre-calculated, basically, right? And as an attacker, that helps you greatly because you can sort of anonymously find these things without having to put any fingerprints out on the internet, right? So that's cool. It's really neat. You can really find these things, and you can really log into them. And you can really find lots of information. Some of these systems are grossly vulnerable. Not only, like with some of these camera systems, it's not just a matter of being able to peekaboo through their cameras, right? Which, if you're a creeper, if you are a pervert of any kind, like, you were born at the right time. This is your day. This is your time to shine. Because there are a lot of these on the internet. Hopefully you know I'm kidding. I actually think it's terrible. I'm just mortified that you can find so many of these kind of things. But, like, literally, this is your day, right? You can even do stuff like, you know, conduct military missions or something through just cameras that are already open. You could maybe look at a port and see that Navy ships come in and out at certain times of day because there's just cameras on the internet that are open that you can just look through. Like, you used to have to go and take pictures from a car window if you're an FBI agent or something. Like, people do that for you now, right? They put it on Facebook. There's cameras on the internet. Like, you just, like, they do the work for you. That's awesome. I love that. So there's a lot of other stuff about these systems that you can find out. I mean, you can log into some of these and you're like, into the car dealer. And what I love about this, you ever have that situation where your car's in the shop and, you know, they're like, oh, hey, we won't be able to get to your car till, like, next Friday because, like, we're completely booked, we're slammed, you know, all the bays are filled up. And you're like, ain't nothing going on in your garage. The first 4 bays are empty. Come on. Tell me the truth. Get to work on my car. Yeah. So these are, I probably should have sanitized those a little more, but these are, like, real systems. Sorry. It is what it is. Yeah, people need to know about this, right? Somebody needs to know that this stuff is out there and they're easy to find and that you can, like, add users to these systems and you can, like, watch cows get born if you're into that. And I'm not into that. I'm not saying I'm not into that, but, you know, do what you need to do. You can check out solar fields and, you know, these systems are expensive, so if you're not a creeper, maybe you just want free software. There's license keys out there, you know? It's like, yeah, there's a $10,000 key. Okay, cool, I'll grab that. Oh, by the way, it runs an old version of Windows 7. Interesting. Maybe we could hack it in some other way. Okay, so, look at all the cameras attached to this system. They have old versions of their firmware. Maybe the cameras have vulnerabilities too. Interesting. Whew. But I changed the password, so I'm okay now. I changed the password. So the system's safe. That's good. Maybe. Although this system's a little odd. You can actually still attach to it even without the password. You just can't see the camera views, which is a little weird. So you're still on their network, their internal network. Why is their camera system on the internet? I have no idea. We did one job, and after the job, we asked the principal in charge of it. It was for a school system. We're like, why was your camera system on the internet? By the way, we could see students, like, you know, camera views, like, you know, girls' locker room and stuff, like, on the internet. Anybody could watch this. And he's like, well, I like to watch the students while I'm away on travel. And we're like, huh? You do what? Well, first of all, what principal travels, and why do you got to watch the students when you're on travel? It's weird. But anyway, I guess there was a legitimate reason. So, and they took it off. So, the mission accomplished. We made the world a little safer. They took it off the internet. It's not that hard to secure these. Take them off the internet, put them behind a two-factor VPN, limit the IPs that can go to them. It's like really basic, like IT security 101, basically, to lock a lot of these down. It's not really rocket science. So, we're out there, fighting the good fight, and that's awesome. It's just that there's a lot of it out there. There's a lot of help needed. There's a lot of need for this kind of security work. So one of the things that was weird about this system, and I encourage you to do this, if you've got a vendor and you've got a product you're interested in and you're taking a look at, go ahead and put the name of that product in the CVE search and see how many vulnerabilities that product has. That product had none. And it's like, whew, man, I feel better because I was starting to think that system was insecure. You know what I'm saying? But there's no CVEs, so I feel a lot better about that now. I'm good. I'm not good, right? That terrifies me. That means nobody cares. Nobody's reporting any vulnerabilities against that system. The vendor's not putting it back out to the community. They're not admitting when they're fixing bugs. They're not putting it, right? It's really bad. If you find 0 CVEs for a system like that, you got problems. That's not a good thing. So we thought, we'll take a little peek. We'll download the actual firmware. And the good news is the firmware is locked down. You can't download the firmware without like a user and pass. So that helps keep the firmware safe, which is good. Unless you do a little bit of Googling, you can probably find a user and pass and download the firmware anyway. Not that we would do that. I wouldn't do that. So let's pretend that there was a vulnerability in that system deeper than just default user and passwords, right? Now, I'm not saying there was, but, there could have been. Sometimes the researchers are hesitant to reach out to those vendors, right, for a lot of reasons. Like, do I want to waste my time? Are they going to blow me off? Are they going to call their lawyer out? There's still a lot of problems. A lot of vendors still haven't really fully embrace the idea of bug bounties and reaching out to the community, or just simply having a secure@company.com on their website. Like, hey, if you find something, here's the email. We'll send you a t-shirt. We'll say thanks. Cool. Just do that. Right? Why would you not do that if you're a vendor? So do that. Please do that. That'll help people. That'll encourage people to find the right contact and report the right vulnerabilities, which we did for that system, by the way. The system's much safer now. And, again, the problem is it's not just that system, right? You can find other types of cameras, other types of systems. They're just on the internet. You watch a school bus drive by. You download the firmware. Once you download the firmware, you realize, man, there's a lot of these things on the internet. And when I tried to contact the vendor, this isn't me, this was some other researcher. He tried to contact a Chinese vendor about a IoT camera. And the vendor was like, we don't care. We don't fix vulnerability. We literally don't care. We're not going to fix that. And he's like, all right, well, I'm going to drop the vulnerability on the internet, which he did. So, and that's not good, right? That's kind of the worst case scenario. That's not how it's supposed to work. There's a better way. So one of my, encouragements there is to try to follow the better way. So, okay, so we saw a device on a pen test like that. What do you do? How does it work? How do you look into it? That's the kind of stuff that we sometimes do. Not just with that camera system, but with other types of systems as well. We've seen lots of different types of systems. We've seen solar panel type systems, and they're all over the internet. And you can learn all about them, and you can find them on Shodan. And apparently, they've sold a lot of these. And you're on the device, and there's a default user and pass, and they're like all over the place. That's really bad. And you'll find that same thing with other types of things too. Like, for example, we found this system with a broad SNMP sweep. It was a Taxenta 731, and we thought, what is that? We've never seen that before. We didn't know what it was. So we had to learn about it, because the knowledge gap goes both ways. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk, was to encourage people that, a lot of times the installers of equipment aren't security people, and security people aren't necessarily experts on, HVAC systems either, right? Heating and cooling and stuff, which turns out this was part of a system like that. So part of what I want to do is encourage you to learn a little bit more outside of your normal domain and maybe learn something about some of these devices. So what's interesting about building controllers in particular is they used to be disparate systems, right? So there was like a closed circuit camera system, wasn't on the internet, wasn't connected to anything. It was like that was the camera system, right? Same thing with the fire drill system and, the maybe burglar alarm if a window was open and stuff. They were all just like kind of electronical, mechanical type systems. They weren't like internet systems, right? And the companies that built those things weren't cyber companies, okay? And then at some point we realized, man, it would be really cool if we could connect all those systems together, right? Like then we could have data about our whole building. We could tell from like a single pane of glass if a window's open or what's going on with the fire, or what's going on with a camera, like all to a single console. And we could maybe even do cooler things beyond that, like you could walk into a conference room and right from your mobile you could adjust the temperature or change the lighting or change the music, so like smart buildings, right? Like the idea of a true smart building has arrived, essentially. It's not in every building, but there are smart buildings out there. And a lot of the buildings, even if they don't have all that, they'll at least have some piece of that, right? Like the building controller and stuff like that that controls the heating and cooling. So, really cool stuff, but kind of scary too if there's no security behind that. That could be a really bad thing if those things aren't being set up and installed correctly. And it's been a challenge for a lot of those companies that make that kind of stuff, right? Because they're not Google. They're not Microsoft. Those aren't the kind of companies that make electrical mechanical systems, right? It's other types of companies that traditionally didn't have to do a lot of cybersecurity or software security. So they've had to, hire a head of, a product security, chief product security architect or something. They've had to hire, SDLC type engineers and people to like fuzz their building controllers and like stuff that was not part of their quality control before. Their quality control before was like, connect pins and make sure that the circuit works right, and it was a different kind of quality, right? So they've had to change. So anyway, back to this device. Grabbed the manual for this device and read about it, and I read that the TAC-Zenta is a highly secured mechanism. So I thought, man, I'm glad to know that, because I was concerned about the way we found it and where we found it and had, default creds and stuff like that. Thought maybe this could be bad. But the manual says it's secure, so I'm convinced that that is in fact the case. And then if you read in one paragraph later, it says you need IE6 and a really old version of Java to connect to this thing, which makes me think one of these two isn't true, right? And I'm pretty sure I know which one of these two isn't correct, right? And that's really the problem there. So, oh man, so I went ahead and did that actually, installed an old version of Java and connected to it, and I found some more diagrams, and some of these diagrams are really scary because you can tell just from reading the diagram, it's like, oh, this is how you hook this to your building. You put this like backdoor modem on, and then you can connect to it from the internet, from home. You can like control the temperature of your building and stuff, and that would be cool. And you're like, oh man, wow, that's really crazy. So you have all this complicated stuff, and then you have a picture like that just kind of terrifies you, right, as a security engineer. Because you're like, I don't know what any of that other stuff is, but I know what that thing is. I know what the blue E means. That's the internet, right? That's the internet connecting to your building. So did a little research. I found out that, according to Google, this is what an HVAC repair person looks like. I'm pretty sure that Google knows everything about that, so I guess that's what they look like. And again, you can find these things on the internet, and if you were to port scan them, you will find that they have services open, right? And if it's on the internet and it's connected to a building and it's running like an FTP server and a web server, it's like, why does that thing have to be on the internet? And why does it need like a web server and an FTP server? Well, probably that's how they update it. And I'm sure there's reasons, right? There's always reasons, but they're not necessarily good security reasons, right? Reading the manual a little more on the user pass, besides the default user and pass, if they did happen to change the password, there's this code that if you forgot your password, you can give them that code and they can help you remember your password, which is nice because, people forget their password. But what's terrifying about that is so obviously there's a way to reverse engineer the way passwords are generated or something, right? Based on that hash. If you can get that, which you can get to it just by connecting to it. You don't have to authenticate to get that number, right? So that in and of itself looks a little worrisome. So what's weird about some of these systems is when you connect to them, the graphics of the UI look really bad. They're really cartoonish. They were written by, some poorly written Java app from a long time ago, and they're they don't look very impressive, but what's scary about that is that even though it looks dumb when you look at the UI, it controls something real, right? So if you push the button, it's going to turn on the boiler or something, right? So be careful what you push if you actually connect to one of these. Don't mess around too much. So default password, log into one of these systems. It's got a bunch of options to look at different things, like monitor the pool temperature of some building in Italy. Not that I would do that. You can download the Java applet. You could audit that, kind of the client side rather than the server side if you want to go after that. A lot of old Java code. And the good news about this device, though, is when you do a CVE search for it, you'll find that it has lots and lots of vulnerabilities for it. And I feel a little bit better about that. I'm not sure I feel a lot better about that than none, because there's lots of them, but at least they're doing something about it, right? Somebody's reporting them, they're getting fixed, they're reporting and they're putting it back out to the community. I kind of feel better about that, honestly. As weird as that may sound, to know that this thing has had known vulnerabilities that have been fixed. And like I said, the thing is, the problem with a lot of these things is they live a long time. So if you talk to the vendor and say, hey, your thing's insecure, they're like, no, this is the new version. That's what they should have in that building. And you're like, well, I get that, but that's not what they have. They have an old one that's on the internet. That's what they have, right? Maybe that's not what they should have, but that is what they in fact have. So that's kind of bad. The new diagram for the new machine looks kind of similar to the old one, but I guess it's more secure, like they force you to change user and pass and stuff, which is good, right? So I think things have gotten better. There's still recent CVs against it, which is good, I guess, right? So they're still being reported, they're still being fixed. That's kind of a good thing. So whose problem is all that, right? Is it the manufacturer's fault? Is it the people who set it up that didn't set it up, change the password? That they call that the integrator, by the way. That's the term for that, right? Because usually the people who buy these, the facilities people for a building, they don't set them up. Your security department doesn't set them. It's the integrator that sets them up. So is it the integrator's fault? Is it the IT department's fault for not knowing what the facilities people are buying and setting up insecurely? Whose fault is that? Well, I talked to some people at JCI, really nice people, really good folks. Really appreciated the time I spent with them. And their director of product security, Jason, said that securing a smart building is a shared responsibility requiring focus and commitment from the manufacturer, integrator, and consumer. Which sounds like a commercial, but it's true. I mean, that's a good point. Basically, everybody involved has to, we can secure those. It's not rocket science. We've known how to secure those for 10 or 20 years, but we need to do it. So that's the thing that's not happening. So everybody has to kind of get involved. So it's more, I feel like, some of the biggest things that would make the biggest impact across the internet are the basic things, right? They're not like the super elite exploits that only, Uber people know about. It's no, we need to take things off the internet and, put passwords on them that aren't terrible and stuff like that. It's kind of the basic stuff. So for builders, the people making this stuff, it's secure design, it's coding, it's responsibly responding to events when they happen, it's forcing a product update, having some plan for how's this thing, because we know this thing's going to live 10 years, right? So we should make sure that we can update it in the field rather than just, preach at our customers that they should have bought the new one, right? There needs to be a better path than just that. So for the installers and the users, integrators, facilities, IT, they need to work together. They need to do basic things like segmentation. Does the building controller need to be on the same network as the domain controller? Probably not, right? Probably not a good thing, especially if that thing's on the internet. So segmentating, strong passwords, monitoring that. Oh, that'd be interesting. And you could even do one better than monitoring, and this would be really cool, and almost nobody does this, right? And that would be like a honeypot, right? So you could set up a fake building controller that looks like the old one with the default user and pass, and so when somebody tries it, it's like an immediate high-fidelity alarm to your SIM tool if you were actually looking for that and monitoring it, right? You would know instantly that somebody's trying to do something bad. You wouldn't get any false alarms out of that. When you look at a lot of the next-gen endpoint products out there, think of whichever vendor name you want to think of, a lot of them generate a lot of noise. It's oh my gosh, all my endpoints are getting attacked constantly all day long. No, not really. There's a lot of false positives out of those tools, right? So there's a lot of noise coming out of certain security tools. But if you had a honeypot mimicking a building controller, nobody should ever try to log into that. It's not even real, right? So if somebody does, it's either a security scanning tool or a pen tester, or it's a real attacker, right? It's only one of three things, basically. So it's a pretty high fidelity alarm. So that would be really cool if you were actually monitoring that stuff, and I don't think too many companies are doing that. But if you were, instead of being behind the curve all the time, you could actually be ahead of the curve, and that would be really wild. Okay, and the last thing, I guess I didn't say it enough, but I'll say it one more time. Just making sure that there's a way to update those things. And if you have to do it manually, that sucks, but a lot of those things, they don't update themselves. So when's the last time you updated your, cable modem router firmware? Maybe recently. A lot of people in here maybe have, right? Because we have a lot of technology people in here. But then it's you think about your neighbor or your mom or your grandmother or whatever. It's they're probably not going to update their Xfinity thing that came with the cable because the cable guy set it up, right? So you don't even know it's there. So a lot of stuff, unless it updates itself, it's probably not going to get updated. And that's I really think that most IoT devices should update themselves. It's kind of scary because then there's pros and cons with that. You wonder, geez, do I really want this thing updating itself all the time? Maybe it'll take a bad patch and crash or something. And there is risk there. So it's a hard problem. And that's one of the things that, kind of an overviewing thing that we see in cyber is at its root, it's a hard problem, right? It's not something that we can really solve. We can get close, we can do better, and we should do better, but we can't really finally solve it. I mean, why haven't the fire department solved fire, and why hasn't the police solved crime, right? It's like, why haven't the IT security people solved security? It's the same kind of problem, really, at the end of the day. If somebody's going to phish somebody or something, it's a human crime. We really can't actually fully stop that, not completely. We can do better, though, and that's what this talk is about. It's kind of, let's do better. Let's see if we can do a little better. So, separations, VPNs, restrict by IPs, least privileges, a lot of the basics. If people just did that, they would be so much better off, and it would really make a difference. Yeah, I think I said all that. Physically secure, too, is important with these kind of devices. A lot of the sort of SCADA and building and all these sort of systems like that, a lot of times you can plug into them physically, right? So you walk up to a thermostat in an airport. If you look underneath it, a lot of times there's like an Ethernet jack. You can actually plug into that, and you'll be on the building network of the airport. And that's not a good thing. Really, random people shouldn't be able to get to that network. They should put like at least a little plastic thing with a lock over it or something, right? That somebody could still break it off with a baseball bat, but you'd probably see them do that in an airport, right? So at least having some control in place would be a good thing, particularly in public buildings. Otherwise, it's relatively easy to get on some of these specialized networks like the BACnet network without going into all the technical details of that. So, strong passwords, making sure your stuff's not findable on Shodan would be really good. Two-factor is huge, right? I mean, it's kind of outside the scope of this, but just having two-factor alone would stop so many different types of attacks. It's kind of a general thing. Secure update policy, I talked about that already. Because software, this is a little tagline for your execs in case they, have a hard time understanding this stuff, but software decays over time, right? It's like milk or fruit or something like that. You build it, it's okay today. 6 months from now, there's a well-known CVE in what? In the product? Probably not. In what? In the third-party libraries that it's built on. Because why? Software is not really so much built nowadays as it is assembled, right? So like 98% of the code of your IoT camera, the people that made your IoT camera didn't write, right? They bought the lens, they bought the camera, and then they realized, oh, there's an image processing library on GitHub, there's this, there's that, there's this, it's being put together. And unlike food, there's no ingredients label on it, right? We don't get to see how many proteins and fats and carbs and stuff are in our IoT camera. It doesn't tell us. We can figure it out really easily. There's actually tools to do that. A lot of the component analysis tools can do that pretty easily, can identify the third-party libraries inside a product. But we don't do that. Not very often. Not very many people do. But if you did, you'd find out that pretty rapidly software decays. Again, you'd find that in 6 months there's a couple, in a year there's like 10, in 18 months there's like 20, and 3 years later there's like 100 well-known vulnerabilities in your product, basically, just based on known vulnerabilities in third-party libraries. I gotta grab some water, sorry. Okay, so what do we do about that? Well, part of that is, again, it's everybody's problem. You could do that. You could check that as the buyer. But really, I feel like the builders should be heavily involved in that, right? They should understand that. They should have a way to train their developers to make sure that their developers understand at least those basic things. And most of them do. Developers are pretty smart. I think I've always had good experiences with developers. They're generally pretty smart. But a lot of times they don't have budget or they don't have manager's approval. Or I remember talking to some developers one time who were secretly doing security. He's like, I want to learn more about fuzzing, but my boss literally told me we're not allowed to spend time on security because it's not in the budget. He literally doesn't want me doing it. So I'll stay late sometimes and do it anyway behind his back. I'm like, that's messed up. That's messed up. That's really weird. That's really messed up. I think that's fairly rare. I think that wouldn't happen in most cases, but I have certainly heard of stuff like that, right? And so that's not good. So having a company that's willing to invest and build that positive culture and reward their employees and saying, hey, not only do we want you to do security, but if you take that class or go to that conference or learn more about it, you're going to be first in line when it's time for a raise or a promotion or whatever it is, right? Because you obviously care. You're one of our leading engineers who knows a lot about security. That's a good thing. Okay, so secure by design. And understanding how's the system going to be used, how can we reduce the attack surface, right? What does that mean? That means taking all those features and going, yeah, we need this, this, and this, but this thing that a lot of our users want and stuff, like, they don't need that. We're just going to take that out. We're not going to build that in. And honestly, sometimes we in the security community, we're guilty of that at times. When are we guilty of that? Well, if you've ever been kind of in the IT security blue team side, a lot of times what IT security people do is they're proud of this too. They know how to drive their vendors, right? They know how to get free dinners out of their vendors. They know how to, make sure their vendors cuts them a deal and gives them 20% off software. And they know how to kind of squeeze please. And they ask for a lot of features, right? Hey, we love your tool, but it's missing this, and this, right? If it had that, then we'd buy it. Okay, well, we're going to add that real quick for this guy because he's a big buyer. Okay, it's not all bad, but we got to be a little bit careful with that, right? Because every time we add a feature, we do what? We increase the attack surface, right? And security products are just like any other product. They have vulnerabilities in them, whether we like to talk about that or not. I think sometimes the security community doesn't like to talk a lot about vulnerabilities in their own security products, but we see it quite a bit, right? So that's something that we need to be really careful with. And then obviously, how do we build our code so that these components can be easily updated? If we find out in 6 months that there's a CVE in our image processing library that we built into our IoT camera, did we do that in a way that's easily updatable? Because if it is, that's good. We can just update it and we can ship a new version of our firmware securely, right? And automatically, maybe not. But either way, we can do that. But if what we did when we built that camera is we took a piece of that library out and we kind of stuck it in our product, but we didn't take the whole thing. We just took the bit that we wanted. Now it's really hard to update that, right? Because whenever there's a vulnerability in this library, it's like, well, you get into this discussion, and I've had a lot of these discussions with vendors, companies, teams, developers, whatever. They're like, yeah, your component analysis tool says that we're vulnerable to 100 things, but we don't think we really are. We're pretty sure that the way we use that library, we don't actually use like those portions of it. That's fine. It's an awkward conversation to have because basically it's like, it's the sort of prove it to me conversation, right? It's like until you can, POC me with an exploit, I don't really believe that this is vulnerable, which, maybe they're right, but maybe they're wrong, right? And that's really the problem. So ideally, if we can avoid that whole conversation and that whole battle and that whole sort of time sink, if we can just make sure that it's easy for us to update our product with whatever libraries we depend on, and that'll help a lot. So all those things are what we call security best practices. And there's a lot of other security best practices like, this medical, system that, takes x-rays of your brain or whatever, it runs on Windows XP SP1. That's scary, right? It takes an x-ray of my brain. You know what I mean? Like, should it be on Windows 10 at least? There's DEP and there's ASLR and you can sandbox the process and stuff like that. That would be better. Wouldn't that be better? Like, how many of you been to the doctor and like noticed that the nurse is like logging into like an XP machine? You're like, I don't feel real good about that. I don't feel good about that at all. So that's not necessarily a good thing. And there's a lot of other relatively simple things besides running on a modern operating system, like static code analysis, like having, dynamic analysis fuzzing, automated testing, all as part of your continuous integration, right? It's all sort of like security 101, but a lot of the companies that make these kind of products, they're not Google, they're not Microsoft, they're not cyber companies, right? They don't have the budget and staff for this. So it's a struggle. Making sure that they have all the right things like security and some accountability, which is what? Accountability is not like blaming the person who made the vulnerability. It's more like, why did we have that vulnerability in our product? Like, where did we mess up? Like, we didn't pay enough for training, or we didn't hire the right people, or we just didn't, that API was confusing. What was it about our development, process that led to that vulnerability? And how can we not just address that, but how can we address all of the vulnerabilities of that category so that the whole thing is more secure just in general? Like taking care of whole classes of bugs. A lot of big vendors have been doing that recently, right? Like Microsoft and stuff like that. When they find a use after free in IE, they don't just fix that one. They think about how can we find all these, right? And sometimes it's hard and sometimes they can't, but they try, right? And I think that others aren't trying. So the other thing you can do for this whole thing is, again, it might sound basic, but put it under the purview of the IT security department and find a security department partner just like you would for your domain, right? So you're pen testing your domain. Why aren't you pen testing the thing that could burn down your building, right? You know what I mean? Like, think about that, right? We'll pen test our domain server, but we won't pen test the thing that could burn down our building. It doesn't really make sense. So we need a partner there too. And as I talked about some of the fancier things, like for builders, you could hide your firmware so it's harder to find on the internet. For users, you can do some of the cyber deception stuff I was talking about, like with Canary and stuff. So I think I mentioned all that. The whole logging and making sure that logs go to the SIM tool. I mentioned all that already. I'm just kind of running through that. But deception, I'm really a big fan of that. I think in the future we'll probably see more of that than what I was talking about before, where you kind of make a fake system that looks like something, sort of some cyber deception, right? Because why not? It's cheap, it's easy. There's systems out there, actually. There's a tool called Canary. I'm not like a rep for that company or anything. I'm not necessarily saying you should buy that one. But there's a lot of products like that that can easily replicate and look like a vulnerable system of one side to the other, so that you can, in your SOC, get high fidelity alarms, which we don't get a lot of in the SOC sometimes. Sometimes the SOC gets a lot of false alarms, and that makes that job harder. They need some good alarms too. Okay, so starting to wrap up. Just giving you a picture of how complex it really is just to secure one thing, just a building, just a smart building, right? The external stakeholders, the people that need to be involved in that process, there's like at least 8 of them, right? And then without reading through them and going through them painstakingly slow, like for internal stakeholders, there's another 8, right? So there's at least 16 people or parties or organizations that have to be involved in trying to keep just one thing like a building safe and secure. And that's really hard. It's a hard problem. But it's really exciting, right? The field we work in is hard, but it's really exciting. I love what we do. Sometimes, it can be a little disappointing. Like I recently talked to the VP of a major bank, and he's like, man, I miss the days of like when the auditor came and he looked through my papers and he could find out that we bounced some checks wrongly or something. But like I didn't have to deal with cyber. I don't want to learn cyber. I'm too old to learn cyber. Like this guy was just like not in for cyber, right? And that's not a good thing. That's a little bit scary if you have an exec in your company that kind of has that mindset that doesn't want to learn new things. That's not going to be good. So yes, security is hard. Your networks, your products, they're all at risk as much as ever. But I want to leave you with encouraging words that it is possible to secure them. It takes passion, it takes diligence, it takes commitment from everybody involved. It takes best practices like safe, design and coding and development, monitoring and response, right? Because we can't catch all the bugs here, but maybe we'll catch them over here, right? So those multiple layers, all the things we've talked about for a long time, it is possible to do them. So I want to thank you guys for listening. There's the Twitter, mine and my company's, and website. And if you want to email me or if you have any questions now, I'll take them. But thank you very much for coming in and listening. So I think the question, if I heard you right, is if you scanned for, let's say, particular cameras or something you found on the internet, would it be possible to contact those individuals? Because they might be individuals, they may not be companies in every case. Could you contact them? Should you? And what would they say if you did? I think that's a hard problem. I don't think a lot of people have tried to do that in every case, right? Sometimes they might do it, particularly if it's their customer or, I think people are doing that onesie-twosie, but to just try to reach out to some guy in Iowa that has a camera on the internet, who knows what kind of result you're going to be met with, right? He might call the police on you or something, right? Yeah. I actually have done that in one case. So one time we were doing a pen test, and I ended up finding the camera system to a local jail, to the sheriff's department, and it was the ladies' jail too, right? And we could see in, like inmate cells, all that stuff. And so I called my local FBI contact, and I was like, hey, how do I let them know without me ending up like in there with them and stuff like that their cameras are on the internet? And he's like, just call them. It'll be fine. Give them a call. So I'm like, all right. So I gave him a call, and I get like 911 dispatch. And I'm like, hey, it's not you, it's me. Try to give him this whole story, explain this technical thing, right? It's kind of hard to explain that to somebody that's not necessarily technical. And they're like, oh, well, let me transfer you to the jailmaster. So he transfers me to the jailmaster, and the jailmaster listens to my whole story, and he's like, whoa, what are you seeing through camera 6 right now? I'm like, I don't know, it looks like a deputy like rocking his chair, picking his nose or whatever. He's like, that's Phil, you really are looking at our cameras. He got all excited about it. And he's like, yeah, we'll get on that, we'll fix that for you, it's not a problem. So, in that case, they were cool. I don't know that every case would go like that, but at least in that case, they were cool about it. Yeah. Good question. I didn't know. Sorry. Somebody probably should, though. You should do that. Yeah. What analysis tools do you use or recommend? So there's at least a couple that I know of. I actually like the one by Synopsys. They have one called Protocode that I think works pretty well. It's pretty awesome, actually. You just take any executable, any zip file, any kind of packaged thing, you drop it, and it basically tells you, you have 100 CVEs in this product. And it's not necessarily accurate, right? Because it's just giving you that data based on known CVEs and based on the components that are in your thing. So it's not necessarily 100% accurate. What I like about it, though, is you can get data over time. You can tell that this thing over time is getting better, it's getting worse, like the vendor doesn't care, they don't know. Like you can get some insight even though it's not complete. It gives you a piece of the picture. Yeah.
So this hits really close to home for me because I actually used to be a security integrator, and now I'm in IT security, so I've actually done a handful
Yeah, no, I mean, we do that. I mean, we can definitely do those assessments, and there are certainly plenty of others that would